In. Okay, I think we started. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third of our series of webinars on the U.S. election. We are 1 week away from the election, and unfortunately, it's still pretty much up in the air. My name is Tulio Vera. I'm the interim CEO, president of Global Americans. Global Americans is a nonpartisan policy think tank. And although we're nonpartisan, we talk to everybody on either side of the political spectrum. So the first two of the sessions were on more specifically on the Democratic and Republican policy side. Today we're going to focus on the Latin American countries themselves. So in that regard, it is my pleasure to have a conversation with three experts, friends on some of the key countries in the region. I wanna welcome Sergio Guzman, Jorge Mariscal, and Ricardo Penfold, who are going to speak on the U.S. presidential election, the impact on Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela, respectively. So let me give some quick introductions and some format. Sergio is the director and co-founder of Colombia Risk Analysis, where they provide commercial security and political risk analysis on the Andean region. Prior to that, he was at Control Risks, a risk consultancy firm. He teaches at Externado University of Colombia. He received his MA from John Hopkins SAIS, International Economics and Relations School, and he has a BA from GW University. Jorge Mariscal is an adjunct professor at Columbia University at CPAC. Prior to that, he spent several decades on Wall Street and financial markets, specializing in emerging markets at UBS, at Rohatyn Group, at Goldman Sachs, and at other financial institutions. He has a bachelor's degree in economics from the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana in Mexico, and he holds a PhD in economics from New York University. And then finally, Ricardo Penfold is a sovereign analyst in emerging markets at Seaport Global. Ricardo has spent several decades in the financial markets and professional experience. Most recently, he was a managing director at Goldman Sachs Asset Management in New York, where he ran macro analysis and portfolio management. Prior to that, he had several posts in his native Venezuela, chief economist at Santander Investment in Caracas, and several roles in the public sector. He has a BS degree from Boston University and a master's from the University of Pennsylvania. So the overarching topic for this series has been the U.S. election, as I said, and the impact on Latin America. For today's webinar, I've asked the speakers to speak on their expectations for their specific countries, focusing, but not necessarily focusing on rule of law, immigration, trade, security, but we're flexible and they can deviate from this. So the webinar will last about an hour. Each speaker will present for about 10 or 12 minutes. I'm going to try to be strict about that because if not, we run out of time for Q&A. And then after their presentations, initial remarks, we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience, which you should type into the chat function in the Zoom link. So without further ado, thank you for being here this morning. Thanks to the three speakers. And we're going to start with Sergio on the impact of the U.S. election on Colombia. Sergio, the floor is yours.
Julio, thank you very much. And to everybody, it's a pleasure to be here alongside my co-panelists. As Tulio said, Colombia Risk Analysis very recently, and I mean 2 months ago, we published our scenario paper, a paper that is free and available to the public, talking about what would be the impact in Colombia in the event that either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump wins the election. So I'm going to walk you through what that paper says a little bit. You can find it extensively, 54 pages in our website. But we do think in many different levels, the implications of the U.S. election in Colombia will be profound. Overall, our assessment and looking at the polls and perhaps a hint of wishful thinking is that the Democratic candidate Kamala Harris may win the election next week. And with that, I think the Petro administration will find a willing partner, or at least a partner it relates to well. In that sense, I think the Petro administration who has had this idea of having progressive members of the Democratic Party aligned with its worldview on the economy, on taxes, on the environment, on migration, very collaborative. So I do think Petro and a Harris administration will find plenty of avenues for collaboration on social inequality, on climate change, on peace and security in Colombia, at least nominally. This does not mean that Petro will consider a change in position with regards to his very strong stance on Israel and the situation in Gaza, or his ambivalence regarding the situation in Russia and Ukraine. On Venezuela, I think Petro is unlikely to change his stance because in no way is this necessarily beneficial for him to take a stronger or more firm position on the Maduro administration. We think that Petro taking a position on the Maduro administration now, although would be entirely coherent with the same worldview that he has espoused in places like Guatemala, where there was a takeover by the ruling party then of the electoral process, and then stalled the possession of President Bernardo Arevalo, and Petro went to Antigua and basically said, until Arevalo is inaugurated, I'm not leaving. Unfortunately, he's not going to take that same position uh, with the Venezuelan situation, and it's not likely that Petro will want to compromise the ongoing peace negotiations with the ELN and the Segunda Marquetalia, both of whom make a strong presence in Venezuela. Nevertheless, we see that at least on the climate discussion, Petro is very willing and very open to continue partnerships and collaborations with the United States. Apropos, the US donated a number of helicopters to Colombia last week, which Petro has named Guacamayas. Usually, helicopters or donations of military hardware to Colombia have been with a counter narcotics point of view. And now, since the Biden administration took over, some of those assistance packages have been headed towards environmental protection circumstances. So I think, at least in the area of focus where there will be most collaboration between a Kamala Harris administration and a Gustavo Petro administration, will be the environment. The second area where we think there will be areas for collaboration will be social inequality. I think in the United States, this issue has permeated, and as Harris will be the first Black woman president, I think Petro will take that, and so will the Harris administration, as a symbolic objective, as a symbolic gesture of greater participation of women and minorities in the political process. So I do think that there will be a lot of synchronicity. The areas where we think that there will not be as much synchronicity include Venezuela and Israel, because obviously Petro's position on Israel has been quite firm. He has not, shied away from calling names on Netanyahu or accusing Israel of committing genocide in Gaza and in other parts of the Palestinian territories. And that, even with the Democratic Party, is not necessarily a line they want to cross. I think the Democrats want to continue engaging as productively as they can with Israel, and this is a bipartisan issue. So I do think that under a Kamala Petro administration, this Colombia would not become a bipartisan issue anymore. Although in Colombia still migration and drugs continue to be central to the discussion, I think the Biden administration has contributed and has worked in partnership with the Petro administration to halt the flow of migrants and halt the flow of drugs. But they've not necessarily pushed buttons in Colombia regarding, for instance, aerial eradication, forest eradication, fumigation, or substitution programs that effectively work. So I think those are still going to be, points to continue working. I think U.S. assistance to rule of law implementation in Colombia will continue to be important, but perhaps the most central issue is going to remain for Petro and for the Harris administration, the environment, migration, and drugs in that order. So I think deprioritizing drugs will continue to take place. On the opposite scenario, a Trump Petro sort of combination, we do see this going to be faring very poorly. Um, Mostly for Petro, not as much for Trump, who can always use this, to agitate people in South Florida and hardcore Magazuelans and other Republicans that are very adamant, and picking a fight with Petro may be in both countries' best interest. Now, the question is, how will that fight evolve? Will it only be held on social media? Will Trump threaten with renegotiation of key components of the US Colombia Free Trade Agreement, which he did successfully with NAFTA? Now, a changed treaty with Mexico and Canada. But I think, at least that proposal is a long-winded one, and I don't think that this will necessarily happen soon. The U.S. can't impose, because we have a free trade agreement, any sort of unilateral tariffs or any sort of measures that will hamper our trade relationship in the short term, because all of this will have to be negotiated within the U.S. Colombia FTA framework. So at least we don't see a very large chance of disruption. What we do see is that Trump will side with Republicans in Congress who want to cut aid to Colombia, because they will not see Colombia as a willing partner in ongoing efforts for rule of law, justice, or even negotiations in Venezuela or the war on drugs. It is no surprise to anybody that during the Duque administration, Trump threatened and had to be persuaded not to decertify Colombia. I think the potential of persuading Trump not to decertify Colombia in a Trump Petro scenario is not going to fly. So I do think that Trump will throw around those threats, perhaps even acting on them when the time of decertification comes, which is around September of next year. So if anything, the relationship is going to start bombastically, and Petro is, of course, going to take hands and make this a personal fight between himself and Trump. And obviously, this is going to be quite negative. As a result, we also expect, potential Colombia beginning to realign itself geopolitically and geostrategically. Colombia has already signaled its intention of joining BRICS. As you know, the meeting that happened last week in Kazan, Russia, was well attended by leaders of all over the world, not attended by Nicolas Maduro, who did not join BRICS and was not allowed to join BRICS. But Petro very much wants to would be enthusiastic of joining BRICS in a scenario where Trump is president, is, if anything, to signal Colombia's very broad diplomatic objectives. And also, Colombia announced, this is not yet materialized, it announced it wants to sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative, something that for both Democrats and Republicans alike is a non-starter, or is an issue that there's almost unanimity. So even in the Trump scenario, the nature of the bipartisan U.S.-Colombia relation is bound to become more fractured. And of course, and Ricardo will speak more about this as well, I think Trump's position on Venezuela may be much more forceful and ask Petro to take a stronger stance or a firmer stance. No idea what the consequences of that may be, but there's already talks in Congress that Petro is not necessarily a helpful partner. He's a less helpful partner now after July 28th than he was before the elections on July 28th, and that didn't necessarily do much good. I know I'm short on time, but I also want to talk about the outlier scenario. And I think the outlier scenario is something that we need to concern ourselves more and more. And that is what happens if Kamala Harris wins the election and Donald Trump does not recognize the results, and in fact becomes a much more contentious situation that may possibly mirror, Ricardo, what's going on in Venezuela, but opposite in terms of power dynamics. And it is a candidate that will want to instigate more people to turn out in the streets and will want to instigate people to disobey the results of the election, even with the state selectors and all that jazz that we saw play out on January 6th, 2021. And so the question is, in this scenario, which is an outlier, and we don't think that it's the most likely possibility, but still a probability, is how leaders around the world rally in support of U.S. democracy and U.S. democratic values. And we think Petro will want to take a frontline in that sort of debate, similar as the one he's taken with Israel and Gaza, and similar to the one he took on Guatemala. So in that sense, Petro and Trump are much more bombastic. Petro and Harris are much more predictable. So for Colombia, undoubtedly, Kamala Harris presidency seems to be an omen for a much more predictable, smooth relationship, a working partnership between both our countries, and a hope for bipartisan collaboration to continue.
Perfect. Okay, Sergio, good timing. 12 minutes. I timed you. Okay, Jorge, you're going to be up next. I know you shared some slides with me, which I am going
Yes,
to bring up now. What did I do with
that's
those?
not it.
This is it, right? Can you see them?
Yes, yes,
Okay,
I see. You put the first one
so
up.
here we go.
Okay, let's just set the stage. Some of these figures are well known by many of you, but I just wanted to put a context of what's at stake with this election. You can go back.
Yep, sorry about that. I'm a disaster here. Okay, sorry. There we go.
So what's at stake is 800 billion in two-way trade between the U.S. and Mexico, as the sum of U.S. imports and exports going both ways. Mexico has become the #1 trading partner of the U.S., displacing China, displacing Canada. The U.S. buys 80% of Mexican exports, so the majority of the export activity is linked to the United States. There is a record $65 billion worth of remittances expected for this year. That is about 3% of Mexico's GDP. And the U.S. is dependent on Mexico for a number of supply chain points to make cars, to make some electronics, to make parts for Boeing airplanes. And this link allows the United States to remain competitive. And without it, I think things would be more challenging for the US industry. And finally, there's a 2,000-mile border where 300,000 illegal immigrants cross on a yearly basis, up and down, depending on enforcement. And it's also the main source of drugs and weapons across Mexico and the US. So the stakes are high. Can you move to the next one, Tulio, please? So no matter who wins, Trump or Harris, the uncertainties are rising, and they're rising also because in Mexico there's a new president, Claudia Sheinbaum. So the external uncertainties compound with the local uncertainties, create an environment of high uncertainty. Now, if we go back to the first administration where Trump was president, he didn't bite as much as he barked, at least not against Mexico. He did more against China. He, in fact, got along pretty well with AMLO, and that might be sympathy among autocrat governments. But as we've seen with Orban in Hungary and Putin, he has respect for this type of governments. But however, Trump 2.0 seems to be much more radicalized in both immigration and trade matters, and that raises the uncertainty for Mexico. Now, Kamala Harris is, without Biden, is a lesser known entity, but I have to admit that during her campaign, she has become more like Trump. She is pro this bipartisan bill that would create a great deal of additional enforcement along the U.S. border, will build the wall. And it's doubtful that she will pull back on the trade protectionism that the U.S. has displayed towards China. Although I think, like Trump, she probably won't mess with Mexico on the trade front. Now, Claudia Sheinbaum takes office with a strong public mandate. She was ahead of her closest competitor by 30 percentage points. They have control of both the Senate and the lower house. But she's under tremendous pressure to address violence, which is overwhelming Mexico in several regions, especially in the north and in the center. And she's facing, AMLO left her with a 6% budget deficit that she needs to address, and with a slowing economy, both in the US and in Mexico, as we expect for this and next year. And she also has to shake the image of her predecessor, who's still very large. She's not as charismatic communication-wise. So that only adds to the external uncertainty that we see from the outside. So you move to the next slide. So what are the key issues and what's the likely impact? Well, so on immigration, we expect from the Harris campaign pressure to secure the border and house immigrants in Mexico. So to some degree, Trumpetization of immigration policy. On the Trump side, we expect much stronger border enforcement, the occasional use of the army, mass deportations where possible. There is about 11 million illegal immigrants. About 4 million of them are Mexicans. Only a fraction were to be deported. It would create a significant humanitarian crisis along the border. On remittances, there's no proposal from Harris. J.D. Vance has proposed, with another congressman, a 10% tax on illegal flows. This could trim, assuming that this affects 1/3 of the remittances. So some of the remittances are from legal Mexicans. So the ones that are from illegal Mexicans, if we assume 1/3 is affected by this tax, that could trim Mexico's GDP by 1 to 2%. On the NAFTA, or TMEC, as people like to call it in Spanish, and nearshoring, we expect from Harris a ratification of the treaty in 2026, perhaps with some attention to labor standards and wages, and a bit of attention on green energy, which would fit well with Claudia Sheinbaum's agenda. But otherwise, policy towards Mexico on the trade front would remain similar to what we have seen with President Biden. Now, on the Trump camp, we expect a much stronger opposition to Chinese investments in Mexico, especially if they're geared towards exporting into the US. There's been about $10 to $12 billion announced of intentions of Chinese companies to settle in Mexico. This could be wiped out right away. And there's anecdotes that the threat of tariffs across the board in Mexico is scaring, or at least putting on pause, some of the investment projects by not only Chinese, but other international firms in Mexico. And ultimately, Trump is not a great fan of the NAFTA. He has, on a couple of occasions, implied that the US would be better without it, better off without it. So in the renegotiation in 2026, we could tighten geographic content, so to make sure that no North American firms take advantage of NAFTA, which ultimately would hurt the whole phenomenon of reshoring, which Mexico has put so much hopes on. On drugs and arms, we expect greater cooperation under the Harris administration, as Sheinbaum needs greater cooperation. As I said, the Mexican government is being overwhelmed in several states in Mexico, in the north, the region of Guanajuato, the Bajío region, and she could use some help from the US. Now, Trump has threatened direct interventions, missiles to the labs that produce fentanyl and other drugs, as if we really knew where they were, but maybe they know better than Mexican army. And pressure to abandon the Hawks not bullets, the abrazos pero no balazos, which has been the policy of the AMLO administration, and it's been reinstated by Claudia Sheinbaum. Finally, on indirect financial impact, we expect fiscal accounts to worsen under both administrations, Harris or Trump's, but they probably will worsen faster and for longer under Trump, given the tax cuts that he proposes and the spending that he has announced. All of which will lead to higher, in our view, higher rates in the long term, and pressures on inflation expectations. It's possible that the financial markets rally more under Trump for the reasons being short-term boost from profitability, but people will focus on the budget more and more, and the Trump administration is likely to do worse on this front. So interest rates in the long term will probably rise more under Trump, fostering a strong dollar and a weaker peso. So we expect under the Harris scenario, less uncertainty compared with the Trump scenario, slight appreciation of the of the peso because of the removing the Trump uncertainty. And all of that gets heightened by the impact of potential Trump administration, weaker peso, less investment, likely recession in 2025. There is an imponderable here, which I think we need to take into account. Harris and Sheinbaum, if Harris were to win, would be the first two women presidents of their own countries. And they're both progressive. They would probably get along better. Trump's admiration for strongman leaders in the past, like Putin and Orban and others, makes it probably difficult to think of a good relationship between him and Sheinbaum. But I'll leave it as a question open. The last one, please, Tulio. The other way.
Yeah. Hold on. There we go.
So to conclude, if we look at the main drivers of country risk in Mexico and investment flows, central bank independence, fiscal management, NAFTA, rule of law, and organized crime, I think it's fair to say that we have no real concerns with the central bank independence, even though it's been directed by an AMLO appointee. They have followed their mandate for low inflation quite strongly. On fiscal management, they were doing pretty well up until the last year, which you could say was due to the election, but we need to see what Sheinbaum will do in the context of lower growth with all the commitments and social transfers that she has undertaken. On the NAFTA, still likely that things go well and there's no real change in NAFTA, but with Trump winning, there's a question mark. The rule of law, Mexico, they just published the latest rule of law statistics, and Mexico is dropped again, as it has for the last 5 years, and it ranks now in the bottom third of rule of law internationally. This is a question mark. The judicial reform and other reforms that Mexico has done that could undermine the rule of law further. On organized crime, this is the biggest concern, and whether Harris or Trump win, this is going to be a major issue to deal with. Much more contentions with Trump and with Harris. With this, I'm going to stop.
Okay, good. Thank you, Jorge. Let me go to Ricardo. Ricardo, you're up.
Sure. Thank you, Tulio, and thanks for Global America. I'll start my timer with 12 seconds. Hopefully, I'll be shorter than that. So you asked about rule of law, immigration, and security. Rule of law is easy. There's none. Or Maduro is the law. Then immigration, huge problem there. 25% of the population has left. This is civil war-like, and it's a huge concern, and it is an electoral concern in the United States. Security, I would narrow it to drug trafficking and energy. But let me start with a preamble. And it's that Venezuela, up to maybe 2 to 3 years ago, was of little to no importance to the rest of the world, maybe to Colombia and to Brazil. And then we had the Russian invasion and the immigration crisis. So energy and immigration were game changers for Venezuela. The EU needed to diversify its energy sources and the U.S. needed to reduce the flow of immigrants going into the United States, which was putting also a big strain on neighboring countries and security in neighboring countries too. You're seeing it with the Tren de Aragua pretty much everywhere, even in Colorado in the United States. And it's also very important that the Trump administration, Jorge said that versus Mexico was a lot of bark and no bite. Versus Venezuela was a lot of bark and a lot of bite, and it really did hurt Venezuela to the extent that the Maduro government realized that it needed to engage with the United States to survive politically in the medium to long term, and this they started to do with the Biden administration. Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey were not strong enough to loosen or cut the noose that was built by sanctions that was strangling the Venezuelan economy. And then you had the Doha Accord, which I think is really important. And this is a bilateral negotiation between the United States and Venezuela that led to the Chevron contract, which is a major change in the way Venezuela is leading energy policy. This contract, this Chevron contract, and they've replicated with Eni, Repsol, and Morel and Brom, the French company, effectively privatizes the production, not the ownership. It privatizes the production, the sales, procurement. Anything that has to do with oil is privatized except the ownership. This is an enormous change regarding how Venezuela was carrying its oil policy, and that's something I believe that they wanted to carry. They wanted to carry through, and for that to recover oil production, which went from 3.4 million barrels a day when Chavez won to 400,000 at the trough. Right now, it's roughly at 900,000. Fiscal policy also, the government started tightening fiscal policy to reduce the parallel market differential with the official rate, and importantly too, they gave the private sector a lot of leeway in importing foods and other goods, which is a radical change relative to the way the Chavismo had operated. And the Doha negotiations led us to the Barbados Accord. The government thought that they could divide the opposition as they had in the past, and via a very biased election where the government pretty much controlled all the levers. They could legitimize Maduro both locally and internationally, and then this lead to sanctions being lifted and oil production picking up, and Maduro back in the international arena. And this backfired dramatically. The opposition was united. And in two other occasions in the past, they had been united and they beat the government. And then the government did a bunch of shenanigans to neutralize the impact of the win. That's what they're trying to do right now. And the opposition was very well organized, and the voting machines, and it's ironic, the voting machines put in place by the Chavismo are foul-proof. They're proven to be foul-proof to the point that 4 months after the elections, almost 4 months after the elections, the government has been unable to show the tallies and show something that they have won. And I want to point out something. I mean, how did Maria Corina get 85% of the tallies? I mean, there was a mutiny within, that's my understanding, a mutiny within the government. Military officials submitting tallies to the opposition, CNE officials submitting tallies to the opposition. So here you have a really disenchanted country against the government, and Maria Corina's electoral strategy has been spotless. A person that came, some argue, from the very radical right, that did not want to hold elections, that thought elections were legitimized, is actually putting the government in a very difficult position right now, both domestically and internationally. And it's important to note that the Chavismo had used the elections to legitimize the regime, with all the biases you want, with all the money that they threw at people to vote in their favor. they were always legitimized via election, and that has been lost. So we're in this is a very different ballgame. And I think you have to give the Biden administration credit for, in a way, enticing the Venezuelan government to go the electoral route. And a big mistake was done. And now you have a government that is both internationally and especially locally far weaker than it has ever been. It has lost legitimacy, to the point that Lula and Petro have also questioned the validity of the electoral results announced by the government. Now, the question is the government domestically and internationally weak enough to force a change? You've seen the government relying to very heavy-handed repression to stay in power. How long can they keep at this? Will it cause a break within el Chavismo? And what policies should the US government and Brazil and Colombia and even Mexico follow to try to force or catalyze, let's not say force, but catalyze a change in Venezuela? The US has to balance immigration, reducing the influence of Russia, China, and Iran in Venezuela, the drug trafficking, and EU's energy diversification versus democracy in Venezuela. How they manage that, I think, is going to determine how what kind of policies on the sanction front the U.S. will be following. Under Trump, it's very unclear how he will react. As I said initially, he was very strong initially in his first government, barking and biting. Going forward, he's very pragmatic, as Jorge has said. I mean, the guy likes strong men, and you do have a couple of former Trump administration officials talk about Trump speaking highly of Maduro. So it all will depend, and I think key will be whether Marco Rubio what role will he play in the administration. If he's Secretary of State, then the policies toward Venezuela might be tightening sanctions significantly, both individual and on the oil sector. But it also depends on whether the oil sector convinces Trump that this policy that the Biden administration has followed should be maintained. And it's also going to depend on cooperation or coordination with the EU. Will Trump coordinate with the EU, Colombia, and Brazil, as this administration has? I doubt it, but that is key. And in terms of Kamala, I think that she will follow a policy very similar to what we're seeing right now. I don't see her lifting sanctions with Maduro in power. That is a line that will not be crossed. I believe I do think, and that's an important point, that you might have people in El Chavismo that understand that Maduro needs to leave, and they're waiting to consolidate power and then sort of engineer an exit strategy for Maduro, and you have a transition within El Chavismo. Let's not forget again that the Venezuelan government has lost legitimacy, both internal, especially internally. And again, going back to Kamala, I mean, it's going to be OFAC that at the end is going to be determining Venezuela's oil production. And I think they're going to stay where they are, not giving Venezuela much more upside. And as was pointed out before by Sergio, I mean, in BRICS, the BRICS meeting in Russia, Venezuela went and was not granted even a seat in the table. It was there as a spectator, and Brazil blocked its membership, which I think is very telling. So Maduro is becoming more and more isolated. So that's it for me, Julio.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo. Okay, I would ask folks that are listening in to please post their questions on the chat. We have one question up so far, but I'm going to take the host prerogative, and just have some follow-ups here quickly for everybody. So on Sergio, you seem to kind of gloss over the idea that in a Trump scenario, the FTA with Colombia would be respected. Can you elaborate on that? What was preventing him from what would prevent him from just kind of raising tariffs across the board, and what would it do to the FTA with Colombia? Let me just pose all three questions. Jorge, as far as the auto sector in Mexico, Trump has argued that at different points in time he will put 100% tariff, 200%, etc. How do you think about that? And that will be the question for you. And then with Ricardo, we've heard from some speakers, I'm not going to quote names, but that potentially the Trump administration would take a more aggressive, and by aggressive I mean a more military, could take a more military posture towards Venezuela, especially now that it's clearly that the July 28th election is considered illegitimate by the world, essentially. How do you think about that? How do you think about the idea of a military intervention in Venezuela by the U.S.? And so I'll let you guys go, Sergio and Jorge and Ricardo.
Sure. So I think one of the reasons why Trump targeted some countries over others for stronger actions on trade or against trade was looking at the U.S. trade deficits or trade surpluses as they were. And so I think Mexico was a clear target of Trump because of the huge trade deficit the U.S. had with Mexico, so was China. In this sense, Colombia has a trade deficit with the U.S. The U.S. has a 3.9 billion trade surplus. This is only for 2022. And as Colombia will require more gasoline, more fuel to serve its already hampered demand, or Colombia, by not producing new oil and gas, is going to need to import gas and other oil components, and that will have a positive effect on U.S. trade surplus with Colombia. So I think Trump will look to target countries that have a larger, opportunity to affect the U.S. trade deficit globally, and Colombia, I don't think is one of them. And at the same time, I think Colombia is not that significant for Trump to begin with, to take this, because this has to be taken up with Congress, and it also has to be taken up with the Colombian Congress. So if this explodes or doesn't work, all it does is push Colombia much closer to the Belt and Road Initiative, much closer to doing a free trade agreement with China than it would necessarily have to having an impact or at least a punishment on Petro. So I don't think, with the USMCA, there were a lot of things on the table, and Trump had two partners that were willing, but not really, but sort of had to. With Colombia, I think the stance is a little bit different. But I'd welcome other people's feedback if they think that I'm incorrect in this assessment.
Jorge?
Julio, I'll make 3 points on that. First, the high level of tariffs that Trump has threatened are mostly towards Chinese cars produced in Mexico and exported to the U.S. Putting a tariff on Mexican cars and auto parts will violate the NAFTA agreement. Mm-hmm. So it would have to be revised in 2026, and Trump would have to get out of that somehow. That's point number one. Point number two is that the American automakers need Mexico. So there would be a huge lobby to not put tariffs on Mexican cars and auto parts, because it would increase the cost of production, and it would lead immediately to increasing prices in cars in the United States. And finally, Elon Musk, which is a big Trump supporter, is planning to have a mega factory installed in Monterrey. He put it on hold to wait for the Mexican election to be defined, but this is very much in the planning. So I doubt that. I mean, at some point, American corporations know that North America needs Mexico to be competitive, and I think doing something against Mexico directly would be unlikely. Would be very much lobbied against by the Congress and by the forces in Congress. Different story with China. China, I think he'll try to go all out.
Okay, thanks. That's good. Before you answer, Ricardo, let me just weave in a question from Victor Sierra that's in the chat, where he says, what can Trump 2.0 at this point do to help promote true change of government beyond failed sanctions? So it's kind of, I guess, in the similar vein, insofar as the Trump reaction function to Venezuela.
So, answering your first question, a more aggressive stance, pretty much, if I read it correctly, is like military intervention. I think that is an extremely low probability event. It would have huge rejection from all the, or most of the Latin American countries. And I think the military in Venezuela will also reject it too. And you need the military to govern in Venezuela. They're very entrenched in politically and business-like. So that would be a big hit to national sovereignty. And I think you need the military to govern, and that's going to be a very, very unstable equilibria. If that happens, I think it would make a lot more sense, given the strength of the military in Venezuela. I mean, you have a minister of defense that's been minister for 10 years. That's a lot of time. I mean, shows his power. Maybe try to entice them to somehow push for change, for a political transition, for a government of national unity. I think that would be the more interesting, and that I think answers Victor's question. Yes, Trump could be enticed to tighten, maybe strategically, or maybe not, sanctions strategically to weaken them further and force them to negotiate. But again, I mean, you're seeing Maduro trying to get BRICS in and try to soften the grip that U.S. could have on his government.
Okay, thanks, Ricardo. There's a question on, I guess this applies to Mexico, but while Harris has been criticized over her lack of engagement with Latin America as a vice president, she has touted her accomplishments as a prosecutor against Mexican cartels in an effort to appear tough on crime in this year's election. How should the next U.S. administration approach Latin American crime and corruption? Maybe it's a more general question, because Latin American crime and corruption. How would regional approaches and collaboration be likely to differ under a Harris or a Trump administration? Who wants to tackle that one?
Go ahead, Sergio, if you want to go first.
No, please go ahead. I'd like to tack on what somebody else.
Well, my views on this. First of all, many Latin American countries, including Mexico, need the help of the U.S. to deal with these overwhelming forces of organized crime. Now, the way you deal with it, a little bit more unorthodox here. I think there should be a push to legalize most of the drugs, as Colombia is trying to do. So organized crime has two types of business: a business that relate to social demands for things that the government prohibits, drugs, immigration, prostitution. All those things should be legalized and regulated, in my view. And then there's another side of business which relates to extortion, kidnapping, theft. That the government should go all out to try to diminish impunity in that front. And that, in my view, should... So the U.S. has a big role to play in intelligence, in training, in keeping the drug enforcement forces in these countries honest. And I think that the administrations of these countries should realize that without the help of the US, they won't be able to deal with the overwhelming force of these organizations. But they have to do it in a smart way. And I think that fight against things that have a huge demand, like immigration and like drugs, is a losing battle.
I agree with that. Because I was thinking about what I would answer. Of course, the Petro administration wants an utopia, right? Drugs being legalized, Colombia not being sanctioned for anything on this matter, and being able to use that money heavily taxed to influence our social welfare system. But that's not going to happen. I don't think, all the advocates of normalizing drugs, nobody has touched cocaine as an opportunity. And I think also, the advancement of fentanyl and other synthetic drugs is not met with any sort of tolerance or any sort of goodwill for any sort of drug policy reform activists in the United States. So I think, the opposition of any of measure like this will just put them all in the same basket. Fentanyl, cocaine, and heroin should not be legalized, period. And so that's I don't think that that's necessarily a starter, but I think Petro wants to, wage war on the Clan del Golfo, but first he wants to negotiate with them. And the US has a very, very consistent approach of, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists, but with criminal armed organizations, maybe. So I do think that there's opportunities for the Clan del Golfo to be engaged, but that doesn't leave out any of the Mexican cartels, which are very closely intertwined with the Clan del Golfo or the Tren de Aragua. In either way, even in an organized US administration, or where this would be a priority within a US administration, this is not going to be the topic that they start, on January 21st, 2025. So I think we're going to have to be a little realistic about this and think that the status quo is going to continue for the interim future.
Thank you, Sergio. Let me go to a question on another question on Venezuela for Ricardo from Nicholas Forsans. Can we imagine a scenario where Edmundo González will be inaugurated as president on January 10th, 2025 in Venezuela, or is it all over under both Trump and Harris?
Inaugurated where? In Venezuela?
In Caracas, I imagine, not in Madrid.
And by whom? So in Venezuela, that would only happen if the military push for that. And my guess is that the military would go more for a national unity government than for Edmundo González. I think it would make for an easier transition, where the different parties in Venezuela have representation. And then the other one, it would be a replay of Guaidó, which didn't go that well. No, so I don't think a replay of Guaidó 2.0 is going to happen. And in Venezuela, I think it's a transition government is more likely than Edmundo González being president of Venezuela. Yeah.
Well, okay, thanks. I tend to agree with that. The question from Mark Beresford. Any idea what Trump-Harris would mean for the Latin American energy sector, especially Mexico? Who wants to tackle that? Jorge?
Sorry, I'm on mute. Well, it makes a big difference here of who wins. Harris is much more pro clean energy, measure growth on hydrocarbon production, and that jives well with Claudia Sheinbaum, who's an engineer in environmental policy. So Trump, on the other hand, is, drill baby drill. It would be less supportive of clean energy in Mexico. He would probably care little about what happens to Pemex, although it should be in the interest of the United States that Pemex does better. But inevitably, I think Harris would be a much better outcome for the oil and the energy sector in Mexico, generally.
Anybody want to add to that?
I think Venezuela is just a matter of sanctions being lifted or not. I mean, in the case of Kamala winning, I agree with Jorge. She would go for more cleaner energy. Venezuela does have massive gas fields. It's got a law that allows for full private sector participation, but you need sanctions to be lifted for that sector to develop. So without sanctions, Venezuela pretty much becomes again irrelevant from an energy point of view. And Trump, I mean, with his domestic oil policy, just leads to more domestic energy production. Again, Venezuela only becomes relevant from, and if there's little coordination with the EU regarding the Venezuelan issue, Venezuela just becomes important from a migration perspective.
Right.
My view is that, at least in terms of, and energy is closely related to climate change and climate resilience, which, we have a question in the chat about that. I think the US would look favorably at co-financing along with the EU projects on green hydrogen or gray hydrogen that are done in Colombia as a way to make our energy grid much more renewable. And also there would be efforts to, finance or help fund wind and solar energy power plants operating in Colombia. But at the same time, increasing efforts against fighting deforestation or mitigating deforestation in the Amazon region, and carbon capture projects with payment for services from indigenous communities and other local communities may be, paths forward to go. But the idea that Petro has to sort of modify the international financial, multilateral financial institutions to reduce debt of countries that are high risk of climate crisis is a non-starter, because I don't think that this is an issue. France has been pushing for this. Germany has been pushing for this somewhat, but this requires global action on many different fronts that may be on the table, but I think more will be a result of U.S. global policy than U.S. Colombia policy. And to that, I think we can look to what's going to happen in Azerbaijan next week at the COP, but also more importantly, Brazil next year at COP, I think COP 30, I think is going to be the place where the US under the Harris administration will unveil a policy package for the environment.
Great. Well, you answered the last question that was on the chat, so I think we're good, and it happens to be 11 a.m. and I promised you guys an hour. So thanks very much. If I had to ask you guys, put you on the spot, clearly all the polls, everything's is up in the air right now. But if you had to, what's your gut tell you? Who do you think wins? Just one word.
Kamala.
Sergio, huh?
Kamala. Yep. My gut.
Okay. Jorge?
Trump with a divided Congress.
Yeah. Okay, I'll see.
Yours?
My bias is Trump. I don't see it. I just don't see it.
Your bias or your
probably no, not my heart. No, no. My gut. I know that. No, it's my gut, and I feel it just feels like he's gonna win. And then I would agree with the divided Congress, which will limit things. But yeah, hopefully I'm wrong.
For the record, that's not my heart. It's my head was talking on my heart.
Okay. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it very much, and stay well.
Thank you, Tulio.
Have a good